In the scorching heat of a military airbase in Afghanistan, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos thought she was just another mechanic fixing another broken aircraft. She had no idea that a single moment of rolling up her sleeves would expose a secret that would transform her life forever. What started as routine maintenance on an A-10 Warthog became the beginning of an extraordinary journey that would take her from the depths of personal tragedy to the heights of military heroism. The tattoo hidden beneath her uniform sleeve wasn't just ink on skin. It was a map to a past she thought she'd buried, a connection to a family mystery that spanned 3 generations, and the key to solving one of the military's most baffling unsolved cases. When Colonel James Mitchell spotted those intricate symbols during what should have been an ordinary inspection, neither of them realized they were about to uncover a truth that would shake the foundations of everything they believed about loyalty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of serving one's country. This is the story of how a repair job became a revelation, how a chance encounter became a life-changing mission, and how sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with the courage to face the secrets we carry within ourselves. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on Bagram Airfield as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her grease-stained hand. The A-10 Warthog she was working on had been giving her trouble for 3 days straight, and today she was determined to solve the hydraulic problem that kept the landing gear from retracting properly. At 28 years old, Maria had been working on aircraft for nearly a decade, but this particular Warthog seemed to have a mind of its own. Maria had grown up in a small town in New Mexico, the daughter of a single mother who worked 3 jobs to make ends meet. Her mother, Rosa Santos, had always been secretive about Maria's father, only saying that he had served his country and died before Maria was born. The only connection Maria had to her father was an old photograph of him in military dress uniform and a strange medallion that her mother kept locked away in a jewelry box. The heat was becoming unbearable, so Maria rolled up the sleeves of her uniform to get better ventilation while she worked. She was so focused on the hydraulic lines that she didn't notice Colonel James Mitchell approaching her workstation. Colonel Mitchell was known throughout the base as a fair, but demanding officer who had served multiple tours of duty and had a reputation for noticing details that others missed. As Maria reached up to check a connection near the aircraft's belly, Colonel Mitchell's attention was caught by something on her left forearm. There, partially hidden by grease and sweat, was an intricate tattoo that made him stop dead in his tracks. The design was unlike anything he had seen before, a series of interlocking symbols that seemed to tell a story. At the center was an eagle with wings spread wide, but surrounding it were symbols that looked almost like a coded message. Colonel Mitchell had seen similar markings before, many years ago, during a classified mission that still haunted his dreams. The symbols reminded him of a top-secret operation he had been part of as a young lieutenant, an operation that had gone terribly wrong and resulted in the disappearance of an entire reconnaissance team. The official record stated that the team had been killed in action, but Colonel Mitchell had always suspected there was more to the story. Maria noticed the colonel standing beside her aircraft and quickly straightened up, snapping to attention despite the grease covering her hands and uniform. She had heard stories about Colonel Mitchell's legendary attention to detail and his ability to spot problems that others missed. She hoped he wasn't here to criticize her work on the stubborn Warthog. "At ease, Sergeant," Colonel Mitchell said, his voice carrying a strange mix of authority and curiosity. "That's an interesting tattoo you have there. Mind if I ask where you got it?" Maria felt her heart skip a beat. She had always been careful to keep her tattoo covered, not because it violated any regulations, but because it was deeply personal to her. The design was based on drawings she had found among her mother's belongings after Rosa had passed away 2 years earlier. The symbols had been sketched on the back of an old letter, and Maria had felt compelled to have them permanently etched into her skin as a way to stay connected to the mother who had raised her alone. "Sir, it's a personal design," Maria replied carefully. "I had it done to honor my mother's memory. She passed away a couple of years ago." Colonel Mitchell studied the tattoo more closely, his trained eyes picking out details that confirmed his growing suspicion. The symbols weren't random artistic elements. They were part of a communication system that had been used by a special operations unit during some of the military's most classified missions. The fact that this young sergeant was wearing these symbols on her arm raised questions that demanded answers. "Sergeant Santos," the colonel said slowly, "I need you to come with me to my office when you're finished here. And bring any documentation you might have about that tattoo, photos, sketches, anything that might show where the design came from." Maria felt a chill run down her spine despite the blazing heat. She had never been called to a colonel's office before, and the serious tone in his voice suggested this wasn't a routine matter. She nodded and watched as Colonel Mitchell walked away, her mind racing with questions about what could possibly be so important about her tattoo. As she finished her work on the Warthog, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change dramatically. The symbols on her arm had always been a mystery to her. Her mother had never explained their meaning, and Maria had assumed they were just artistic doodles. But the way Colonel Mitchell had reacted suggested they meant something much more significant. 2 hours later, Maria found herself sitting in Colonel Mitchell's office, a folder of documents spread out on his desk. She had brought everything she could find related to her tattoo. The original sketches from her mother's belongings, photos of the finished tattoo, and even some old letters that her mother had kept in the same box. The office was austere but comfortable, with military commendations covering one wall and a large map of Afghanistan dominating another. Colonel Mitchell studied the documents carefully, occasionally glancing up at Maria's tattoo to compare details. His expression grew more serious with each passing minute, and Maria could see that whatever he was discovering was having a profound effect on him. "Sergeant Santos," he finally said, looking up from the papers, "I need to ask you some questions about your family history, and I need you to be completely honest with me. This matter may be related to national security." Maria felt her mouth go dry. National security? How could her mother's old sketches possibly be related to anything that important? She nodded, indicating that she was ready to answer whatever questions he might have. "Tell me everything you know about your father," Colonel Mitchell said. "Your mother never told you his name or what unit he served with." "No, sir," Maria replied. "She always said he died in service to his country before I was born, but she never gave me any details. I always assumed it was too painful for her to talk about." Colonel Mitchell opened one of his desk drawers and pulled out a thick file that looked like it had been classified for many years. The cover was stamped with red letters that Maria couldn't quite read from where she was sitting, but she could see that it was marked with multiple security classifications. "Sergeant, I'm going to show you something that I probably shouldn't, but I believe you have a right to know," he said, opening the file. "These symbols on your arm are part of a communication system that was developed for a special operations unit that conducted highly classified missions in Central America during the 1990s. The unit was known as Task Force Condor, and they specialized in deep reconnaissance behind enemy lines." Maria's heart began to race as Colonel Mitchell continued speaking. The idea that her tattoo was connected to some kind of military operation was both thrilling and terrifying. "The thing is," Colonel Mitchell continued, Task Force Condor disappeared during a mission in 1995. All 6 members of the team vanished without a trace, and they were presumed dead. But these symbols suggest that at least one member of the team survived long enough to pass on this information. He pulled out a photograph from a file and placed it on the desk where Maria could see it. The photo showed 6 soldiers in combat gear, their faces serious as they posed for what appeared to be a mission briefing photo. Maria's eyes were immediately drawn to one face in particular, a young man who bore a striking resemblance to her own features. The soldier in the center is Sergeant First Class Diego Santos, Colonel Mitchell said quietly. He was the communications specialist for Task Force Condor, and he was responsible for maintaining these symbol codes that you're wearing on your arm. Maria stared at the photograph in shock. The resemblance between herself and the soldier in the picture was unmistakable. They shared the same dark eyes, the same strong jawline, and the same determined expression. But more than that, she could see her mother's influence in the man's features as well. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "are you telling me that this man might be my father, Colonel Michel Noded Gravely? Based on the evidence, your name, your mother's possession of these coded symbols, and the physical resemblance, I believe there's a very strong possibility that Diego Santos was your father. And if that's true, it means he may have survived the mission that supposedly killed him." The weight of this revelation hit Maria like a physical blow. Everything she thought she knew about her family history was suddenly thrown into question. If her father had survived the mission, why had he never come home? Why had her mother told her he was dead? And most importantly, where was he now? Colonel Mitchell closed the file and leaned back in his chair, his expression showing the internal conflict he was experiencing. He was clearly weighing the security implications of what he had just revealed against his sense of duty to help a fellow soldier find the truth about her family. "Sergeant Santos," he said finally, "I want to help you find answers about your father, but I need you to understand that this information is highly classified. If we pursue this investigation, it could lead us into areas that the military would prefer to keep buried. Are you prepared for the possibility that the truth might be more complicated than you want it to be?" Maria looked down at her tattoo, seeing it with completely new eyes. What she had thought was a simple memorial to her mother was actually a coded message from a father she had never known. The symbols that had seemed like random artistic elements were actually a map to a mystery that had remained unsolved for nearly 30 years. "Sir," she said, meeting Colonel Mitchell's eyes with determination, "I need to know the truth about my father, whatever that truth might be. If he's still alive out there somewhere, I owe it to him and to my mother's memory to find him." Colonel Mitchell nodded slowly, recognizing the same determination in Maria's eyes that he had seen in her father's photograph. He realized that he was about to embark on an investigation that could change both of their lives forever and possibly uncover secrets that powerful people had worked very hard to keep hidden. As Maria left the colonel's office that afternoon, her mind was spinning with possibilities and questions. The routine maintenance job that had started her day had somehow transformed into the beginning of a quest to solve a mystery that reached back to before her birth. She had no way of knowing that her discovery would ultimately lead her into danger, force her to question everything she believed about loyalty and duty, and reveal truths about her family that would challenge her understanding of what it truly means to serve one's country. The A-10 Warthog that had brought her and Colonel Mitchell together sat on the tarmac, finally repaired and ready for its next mission. But for Maria Santos, the real mission was just beginning. 3 days after her life-changing conversation with Colonel Mitchell, Maria found herself sitting in a secure briefing room deep within the base's intelligence section. The room was windowless and sterile, with walls lined with maps, charts, and computer monitors displaying classified information. She had never been in this part of the facility before, and the high level of security made her realize just how serious her situation had become. Colonel Mitchell had spent the past 72 hours making discreet inquiries through his network of contacts in military intelligence. What he had discovered was both fascinating and deeply troubling. Task Force Condor had not simply disappeared during a routine reconnaissance mission. They had been investigating reports of American prisoners of war being held in a remote facility, prisoners who were supposedly being used for medical experiments by a rogue faction within a foreign military organization. Sitting across from Maria at the metal briefing table was Master Sergeant Jennifer Hayes, a career intelligence analyst who had specialized in missing personnel cases for over 15 years. Sergeant Hayes had a reputation for being thorough and relentless in her pursuit of the truth, even when that truth led to uncomfortable revelations about military operations. She had agreed to help with the investigation into Task Force Condor, partly because of her professional interest in the case, and partly because she had served alongside Diego Santos early in her career. "Before we go any further," Sergeant Hayes said, opening a thick binder filled with documents, "I need both of you to understand the risks we're taking by pursuing this investigation. Task Force Condor was involved in operations that some very powerful people wanted to forget. If we start asking the wrong questions to the wrong people, it could have serious consequences for all of our careers." Maria nodded, but her determination remained unwavering. The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of emotions as she processed the possibility that her father might still be alive. She had called her aunt, her mother's sister, who lived in Texas and was the only other family member who might know something about her father. The conversation had been revealing in unexpected ways. Her aunt, Carmen, had initially been reluctant to discuss the past, but eventually admitted that Maria's mother, Rosa, had been deeply in love with a soldier who had promised to marry her when he returned from his deployment. Carmen remembered that Rosa had received a few letters from Diego during his mission, but then the correspondence had stopped abruptly. Several months later, military officials had arrived at Rosa's apartment to inform her that Diego had been killed in action. But Carmen also remembered something else that had never made sense to her. A few weeks after receiving the official notification of Diego's death, Rosa had gotten a mysterious phone call in the middle of the night. Carmen had been staying with her sister to provide support during her grief, and she had answered the phone when Rosa was too emotional to speak to anyone. The caller had asked for Rosa by name, but when Carmen had explained that her sister was mourning the loss of her fiancé, the caller had hung up without saying another word. "The interesting thing," Carmen had told Maria, "is that your mother seemed to think the voice sounded familiar. She became obsessed with the idea that Diego might still be alive somewhere, but she could never prove it. Eventually, she stopped talking about it, but I always wondered if she knew something she wasn't telling me." Now, sitting in the briefing room, Maria shared this information with Colonel Mitchell and Sergeant Hayes. The revelation about the mysterious phone call added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. Sergeant Hayes made notes as Maria spoke, occasionally nodding as if the information confirmed theories she had already been developing. When Maria finished her account, the intelligence analyst opened her binder to a section marked with red tabs, indicating highly classified material. "What you just told us fits with some irregularities we've discovered in the official records," Sergeant Hayes said. "Task Force Condor was supposedly killed when their position was overrun by enemy forces, but there's several problems with that story. First, no bodies were ever recovered, which is unusual for the type of terrain where they were operating. Second, Their equipment and vehicles were found intact and apparently abandoned voluntarily rather than lost in combat. She pulled out a map showing the mountainous region where Task Force Condor had been conducting their final mission. Red marks indicated the locations where various pieces of evidence had been found, and Maria could see that they formed a pattern that suggested the team had been moving systematically through the area rather than fleeing from enemy contact. Most importantly, Sergeant Hayes continued, "We found evidence that communication intercepts were received from the area for several weeks after the team was officially declared dead. The communications were in the coded symbol system that your father developed, but they were dismissed by command as enemy disinformation." Colonel Mitchell studied the map carefully, his expression growing more troubled as he absorbed the implications of what Sergeant Hayes was revealing. As a career military officer, he understood the delicate balance between operational security and the need to protect soldiers in the field. But he also recognized that sometimes that balance was compromised by political considerations that had nothing to do with military necessity. "Are you suggesting that Task Force Condor was deliberately abandoned?" he asked. "I'm suggesting that the mission they were on became politically inconvenient," Sergeant Hayes replied. "They were investigating reports that American POWs were being held and experimented on by people who were supposed to be our allies. If they had succeeded in documenting those activities, it would have created a major international incident and potentially compromised other ongoing operations in the region." The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Maria realized that her quest to find her father was leading her into a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of military and government leadership. The symbols on her arm weren't just a family mystery. They were evidence of a cover-up that had cost the lives of American soldiers and condemned others to decades of captivity or worse. Over the next several hours, Sergeant Hayes walked them through the evidence she had compiled over years of investigating missing personnel cases. She had developed a network of contacts among veterans who had served in special operations units, and several of them had told her stories about missions that had been classified so highly that even the participants were not allowed to discuss them with their commanding officers. One particularly compelling piece of evidence was a series of photographs taken by a journalist who had been covering refugee movements in the region during the late 1990s. The photographs showed a group of men who appear to be Americans working at a remote medical facility, but their faces had been partially obscured and their identities could not be definitively established. However, one of the men bore a strong resemblance to Diego Santos, and he appeared to be wearing clothing that matched the type of gear used by Task Force Condor. The journalist who took these photos tried to investigate further, Sergeant Hayes explained, but he was told by his editors that the story was too sensitive to publish. He kept the photos, though, and he gave copies to me when I contacted him about missing personnel cases. Maria stared at the grainy photographs, searching for any definitive proof that one of the men was her father. The images were frustratingly unclear, but there was something about the posture and build of one individual that reminded her of the official military photo she had seen in Colonel Mitchell's office. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that finding the truth about Task Force Condor would require resources and connections that went far beyond what the three of them could access through normal military channels. They needed someone with the authority to declassify documents and the influence to protect them from retaliation if their investigation uncovered evidence of wrongdoing by senior officials. Colonel Mitchell had been thinking about this problem throughout their meeting, and he finally made a decision that would dramatically escalate their investigation. He picked up a secure phone and dialed a number that he had memorized but never expected to use outside of an extreme emergency. "General Morrison," he said when the call was answered. "This is James Mitchell. I need to meet with you about a matter that involves national security and potentially missing American personnel. I can't discuss it over the phone, but I think you'll want to hear what we've discovered." General Patricia Morrison was a legend in military intelligence circles. She had spent 30 years building a reputation for integrity and effectiveness, and she had the political connections necessary to protect investigations that might threaten powerful interests. She had also served as a mentor to Colonel Mitchell early in his career, and he knew that she would give their evidence a fair hearing. The phone conversation was brief, but Colonel Mitchell's expression when he hung up told Maria and Sergeant Hayes that their investigation had just taken on a new level of seriousness. "General Morrison wants to see all of our evidence tomorrow morning," he said. "She's flying in from Washington specifically to review what we've discovered. That tells me she already knows something about Task Force Condor that we don't." As they prepared to leave the briefing room, Maria felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension about the direction their investigation was taking. She had started this journey simply wanting to learn more about her father, but now she was potentially helping to expose a conspiracy that had been hidden for nearly 30 years. Sergeant Hayes gave her a folder containing copies of all the documents they had reviewed, along with contact information for some of the veterans who had provided information about similar cases. She also gave Maria a secure communication device that would allow her to stay in contact with the investigation team without using normal military communication channels. "Keep this with you at all times," Sergeant Hayes warned. "If what we suspect is true, there are people who have worked very hard to keep these secrets buried. They may not appreciate our efforts to bring them to light." That evening, Maria sat in her quarters studying the documents and photographs, trying to piece together a timeline of events that might explain what had happened to her father and his team. The coded symbols on her arm seemed to pulse with new meaning as she realized they might be the key to solving one of the military's greatest mysteries. She thought about her mother, Rosa, and the pain she must have endured believing that the man she loved was dead, while suspecting that he might still be alive somewhere. The mysterious phone call that her aunt had mentioned took on new significance in light of what they had discovered. Had her father somehow managed to contact Rosa before disappearing completely? As she prepared for bed, Maria looked at herself in the mirror and saw not just an aircraft mechanic, but the daughter of a soldier who had sacrificed everything in service to his country. Whatever tomorrow would bring, she was determined to honor that sacrifice by finding the truth, no matter how dangerous that truth might be. The investigation that had begun with a chance encounter over a broken aircraft was about to enter its most dangerous phase, and Maria Santos was ready to follow it wherever it might lead. General Patricia Morrison arrived at Bagram Airfield at dawn, traveling in an unmarked military transport that landed on a remote section of the runway away from regular air traffic. Her presence on the base was kept strictly confidential, with only a handful of senior personnel aware that one of the Pentagon's most influential intelligence officers was conducting a classified investigation in Afghanistan. Maria had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with possibilities about what General Morrison might reveal about her father and Task Force Condor. She had spent hours studying the coded symbols on her arm, trying to decipher any hidden meanings that might help their investigation. The symbols had become more than just a memorial to her mother. They were now a potential roadmap to finding her father and exposing the truth about what had happened to his team. The meeting was scheduled to take place in the base's most secure conference room, a facility that was routinely swept for electronic surveillance devices and was equipped with systems that could block any attempts at remote monitoring. When Maria arrived, she found Colonel Mitchell and Sergeant Hayes already reviewing documents with General Morrison, who appeared younger than her 62 years despite the obvious stress lines around her eyes. General Morrison was a compact woman with short gray hair and an intense gaze that seemed to see through any attempt at deception. She had built her career on her ability to uncover hidden truths and navigate the complex political landscape of military intelligence. When she looked up from the documents to study Maria, her expression was a mixture of professional assessment and what appeared to be personal concern. Sergeant Santos, General Morrison said, her voice carrying both authority and warmth, "I've been reviewing the evidence that Colonel Mitchell and Sergeant Hayes have compiled, and I need to ask you some very specific questions about your family history. Some of these questions may be painful, but I need you to be completely honest with me." Maria nodded, steeling herself for whatever revelations might be coming. General Morrison opened a thick folder that bore security classifications higher than anything Maria had ever seen before. "Before I share what I know about Task Force Condor," the general continued, "I need to tell you about a parallel investigation that I've been conducting for the past 15 years. It began when I started receiving reports from veterans about American personnel who had been abandoned during classified operations. These reports were always dismissed as conspiracy theories or the result of post-traumatic stress, but the stories were too consistent to ignore." General Morrison pulled out a series of photographs that appear to have been taken with long-range surveillance equipment. The images showed what looked like a medical research facility in a mountainous region, with several buildings surrounded by high-security fences and guard towers. This facility was operated by a group that claimed to be conducting legitimate medical research on behalf of international humanitarian organizations, she explained. In reality, they were performing experimental procedures on prisoners of war, including American soldiers who had been captured during special operations missions. The revelation hit Maria like a physical blow. The idea that American soldiers had been subjected to medical experiments by people who were supposed to be allies was almost too horrific to comprehend. But as General Morrison continued her briefing, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Task Force Condor was investigating reports that this facility was holding American POWs when they disappeared in 1995, General Morrison said. "What the official records don't show is that Diego Santos and his team had actually succeeded in locating the facility and documenting what was happening there. They had gathered enough evidence to expose the entire operation and identify the people responsible for it." Sergeant Hayes leaned forward in her chair, her expression showing that she was hearing some of this information for the first time. "General, are you saying that Task Force Condor was eliminated because they discovered evidence that would have embarrassed our government?" General Morrison's expression grew even more serious. "I'm saying that Task Force Condor became inconvenient to people who had political and financial interests in keeping the facility operational. The medical research being conducted there was providing valuable intelligence about biological warfare agents and psychological manipulation techniques that certain elements within our own government found useful." Colonel Mitchell had been taking notes throughout the briefing, but he stopped writing and looked up at General Morrison with shock. "You're describing a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of our military and intelligence services." "Exactly," General Morrison replied. "And that's why it's taken me 15 years to gather enough evidence to even begin exposing the truth. The people responsible for abandoning Task Force Condor have spent decades covering their tracks and eliminating anyone who might threaten their secrets." Maria felt her world shifting as she absorbed the implications of what General Morrison was revealing. Her father hadn't simply disappeared during a military operation. He had been deliberately sacrificed to protect a conspiracy that involved American officials collaborating with foreign agents in illegal medical experiments on prisoners of war. General Morrison reached into her folder and pulled out a document that made Maria's heart race. It was a handwritten letter in Spanish, and even before the general translated it, Maria recognized her mother's handwriting. This letter was sent to your mother 3 months after your father was officially declared dead, General Morrison explained. It was intercepted by intelligence services before it could be delivered, but I was able to obtain a copy through my investigation. Your father wrote it from the medical facility where he was being held. With trembling hands, Maria took the letter and began to read her father's words. The message was brief but heartbreaking. Diego wrote that he was alive, but unable to return home, and that he loved Rosa and their unborn child more than life itself. He warned her that people might come asking questions about him, and that she should tell them nothing for her own safety. The letter was dated 6 months after you were born. General Morrison continued gently. Your father knew about you, Maria, and he was desperate to find a way to return to his family. But the people holding him had made it clear that any attempt to escape or communicate with the outside world would result in retaliation against his loved ones. Maria wiped tears from her eyes as the full tragedy of her family's situation became clear. Her mother had spent years wondering if Diego was still alive, but she had never received a letter that would have confirmed her hopes. Instead, she had been forced to raise her daughter alone while living with the uncertainty about whether the man she loved would ever come home. General, Maria asked, her voice barely steady, is my father still alive? General Morrison hesitated before answering, and Maria could see the internal struggle reflected in her expression. As a military officer, the general was trained to deliver difficult news with directness and clarity. But as a person who understood the human cost of military operations, she clearly wished she had better news to share. Based on the most recent intelligence I've been able to gather, General Morrison said carefully, your father was alive as recently as 2 years ago. However, the facility where he was being held has been closed, and the prisoners were relocated to an unknown location. My investigation has reached a point where I need additional resources and authority to continue pursuing leads. The conference room fell silent as the weight of this revelation settled over everyone present. Maria's father had been alive for more than 25 years after being declared dead, held prisoner in a secret medical facility that had been protected by elements within the American government. The coded symbols on Maria's arm had been his way of preserving information that could expose the conspiracy, even if he never lived to reveal it himself. Sergeant Hayes was the first to speak. General, what would it take to mount a rescue operation, or at least determine where the prisoners were relocated? That's exactly what I hoped you would ask, General Morrison replied, pulling out another set of documents. I've been working with a small group of trusted officers to develop a plan for locating and rescuing the surviving members of Task Force Condor and any other Americans who might still be held by this organization. But I need people with the right skills and the personal motivation to see this mission through to completion. Colonel Mitchell looked at Maria, recognizing the determination in her eyes that he had seen in her father's photograph. General, are you asking us to volunteer for an unauthorized rescue mission? I'm asking you to volunteer for a mission that will have full authorization from the highest levels of government once I present the evidence we've compiled to the appropriate authorities, General Morrison clarified. But yes, this mission will involve significant personal risk, and there's no guarantee that we'll find the people we're looking for alive. Maria didn't hesitate. "General, whatever it takes to find my father and bring him home, I'm ready to do it. I've spent my entire life not knowing who he was or what happened to him. Now that I know the truth, I can't just walk away and pretend this isn't my responsibility." General Morrison nodded approvingly. "I hope you would say that, Sergeant Santos. Your father's knowledge of the coded communication system and his familiarity with the people who held him could be crucial to locating the other prisoners. But I need you to understand that once we begin this mission, there will be no turning back. The people we're going after have killed to protect their secrets, and they won't hesitate to kill again." Over the next several hours, General Morrison outlined a plan that was ambitious and dangerous. Using intelligence gathered over 15 years of investigation, they had identified several possible locations where the prisoners might have been relocated. The plan involved inserting a small team into the region to conduct reconnaissance and, if possible, mount a rescue operation. The team would consist of Maria, Colonel Mitchell, Sergeant Hayes, and a handful of other carefully selected personnel who had been secretly investigating similar cases. They would operate with minimal official support to avoid alerting the people responsible for the conspiracy, but they would have access to advanced communication equipment and extraction resources if the mission succeeded. As the meeting concluded, General Morrison handed Maria a sealed envelope containing detailed information about the mission and instructions for preparing herself physically and mentally for what lay ahead. The envelope also contained additional photographs and documents about her father that had been classified for decades. "Sergeant Santos," General Morrison said as they prepared to leave the conference room, "your father was one of the most dedicated soldiers I ever had the privilege to know. He risked everything to expose the truth about what was happening to American prisoners of war, and he paid the ultimate price for his courage. If we succeed in this mission, it will be a tribute to his sacrifice and the sacrifice of all the soldiers who were abandoned by their own government." That evening, Maria sat in her quarters reading through the classified documents about her father's military service. She learned that Diego Santos had been decorated for valor on multiple occasions and had volunteered for the Task Force Condor mission specifically because of his expertise in communication systems and his ability to work effectively behind enemy lines. Most importantly, she discovered that her father had left detailed notes about the coded symbol system that formed the basis of her tattoo. The symbols weren't just artistic elements. They were a sophisticated communication tool that could convey complex information about locations, personnel, and security arrangements. By wearing those symbols on her skin, Maria had unknowingly been carrying the key to finding the secret facility where her father had been held. As she prepared for the dangerous mission that lay ahead, Maria felt a profound connection to the father she had never known. The symbols on her arm were no longer just a memorial to her mother. They were a living link to a man who had sacrificed everything in service to his country and his family. Whatever dangers awaited her in the mission to find him, she was ready to face them with the same courage and dedication that had defined his military service. The investigation that had begun with a routine aircraft repair was about to become a rescue mission that would test everything Maria had learned about loyalty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of military service. For the first time in her life, she felt truly connected to her father's legacy, and she was determined to honor that legacy by bringing him home. 2 weeks after her meeting with General Morrison, Maria found herself in a remote training facility in the mountains of Colorado, undergoing intensive preparation for what would be the most dangerous mission of her life. The facility was officially listed as a routine military training center, but in reality, it served as a preparation site for the most classified special operations in the American military. The The training was unlike anything Maria had experienced in her career as an aircraft mechanic. She was pushed to her physical and mental limits as instructors prepared her for the challenges of operating in hostile territory where capture would likely mean death. She learned advanced combat techniques, survival skills, and how to use sophisticated communication equipment that would be essential for the success of their mission. Her teammates were equally diverse and highly skilled. Colonel Mitchell had volunteered to lead the mission despite the potential damage to his career if their unauthorized operation was discovered. Sergeant Hayes brought her extensive knowledge of intelligence gathering and analysis. The team also included Staff Sergeant Carlos Ramirez, a Special Forces medic with experience in prisoner recovery operations, and Master Sergeant Lisa Chun, a communications specialist who had worked with Diego Santos earlier in her career and remembered the coded symbol system he had developed. The mission itself was both simple and incredibly complex. Intelligence sources had narrowed down the possible locations where the surviving members of Task Force Condor might be held to 3 facilities in a mountainous region that straddled the border between 2 countries that were nominally allies of the United States. The team would insert into the area using civilian cover identities and conduct reconnaissance of each location until they found evidence of American prisoners. Once they located the target facility, they would attempt to make contact with the prisoners and assess their condition. If the prisoners were capable of being moved, the team would extract them and transport them to a predetermined rendezvous point where military aircraft would be standing by for evacuation. If the prisoners were too ill or injured to be moved, the team would gather evidence of their condition and location for a larger rescue operation. The most challenging aspect of the mission was that they would be operating without official backup. If they were captured or killed, the American government would deny any knowledge of their operation. They would be entirely dependent on their own skills and resources to complete the mission and return home safely. During the final week of training, Maria received a message that changed everything about how she viewed the mission. General Morrison had obtained additional intelligence about the facility where her father was believed to have been held, and the news was both encouraging and heartbreaking. According to a source who had worked at the facility until recently, Diego Santos had not only survived more than 25 years of captivity, but he had become a leader among the imprisoned American soldiers. Using his knowledge of military tactics and his expertise in communication systems, he had organized a resistance network within the prison that had helped other prisoners survive the brutal conditions and medical experiments. The source also reported that Diego had never stopped trying to find a way to communicate with his family. He had managed to smuggle out several messages over the years, but most had been intercepted before they could reach their destination. The coded symbols that formed the basis of Maria's tattoo were part of a larger system he had developed to hide information in seemingly innocent artwork and decorative objects. Most importantly, the source confirmed that Diego was still alive and was being held at a facility in the mountains approximately 200 miles from the original location where Task Force Condor had disappeared. The facility was heavily guarded and surrounded by terrain that made approach extremely difficult, but it was not impossible to reach with proper planning and equipment. Armed with this intelligence, the team finalized their mission plan and prepared for deployment. They would enter the target country as humanitarian workers conducting research on rural medical facilities. Their cover story would allow them to travel freely in the region while gathering intelligence about the prison facility and planning their approach. The insertion went smoothly, with the team arriving in the country's capital city without attracting any unusual attention from local authorities. They established a base of operations in a small hotel that catered to international aid workers and began the careful process of moving toward their target area while maintaining their cover identities. The journey to the mountain region took 4 days, traveling in a civilian vehicle along roads that became increasingly primitive as they moved away from populated areas. Maria used the time to study the detailed maps and photographs that General Morrison had provided, familiarizing herself with every aspect of the terrain around the target facility. On the evening before they planned to begin their reconnaissance of the prison, Maria sat alone reviewing the coded symbol system that her father had developed. Sergeant Chun had helped her understand the full complexity of the communication method, and Maria was amazed by the sophistication of what Diego had created. The symbols could convey not just simple messages, but detailed information about locations, personnel, security arrangements, and tactical situations. As she traced the symbols on her arm, Maria felt a profound connection to her father that transcended the years of separation and uncertainty. The tattoo that had begun as a memorial to her mother had become a direct link to a man who had never stopped fighting to return to his family, even under the most impossible circumstances. The next morning, the team began their surveillance of the target facility from positions in the surrounding mountains. Using high-powered optical equipment and electronic monitoring devices, they were able to gather detailed intelligence about the prison's security arrangements and daily routines. The facility was larger than expected, consisting of several buildings surrounded by multiple layers of security fencing. Guard towers were positioned at strategic points around the perimeter, and patrols moved through the area on irregular schedules that made predicting their movements difficult. Most concerning was the presence of what appeared to be sophisticated electronic surveillance systems that would make approaching the facility extremely dangerous. However, the team also observed evidence that confirmed they had found the right location. Several individuals in prison uniforms were visible working in a courtyard area, and one of them matched the physical description and estimated age of Diego Santos. Although they could not definitively identify him from their distant observation post, the resemblance to both Maria and the old military photographs was unmistakable. After 3 days of surveillance, Colonel Mitchell made the decision to attempt contact with the prisoners. Using equipment provided by General Morrison's intelligence network, they would try to establish communication with the prison using the coded symbol system that Diego had developed. If they could make contact, they might be able to coordinate their rescue attempt with resistance activities inside the facility. The communication attempt was scheduled for the middle of the night when guard activity was at its lowest level. Maria would operate the transmitter using her knowledge of her father's symbol system, while the rest of the team maintained security around their position and monitored for any sign that their activities had been detected. As midnight approached, Maria felt her heart racing with anticipation and fear. She was about to attempt to communicate with her father for the first time in her life, under circumstances that neither of them could have ever imagined. The coded symbols that connected them across the decades would either help them reunite or lead them both into mortal danger. The transmission began with a simple identification sequence that would let anyone monitoring the frequency know that the sender was familiar with Diego's communication system. Maria sent the symbols slowly and carefully, knowing that any mistake could compromise the entire mission. For several minutes, there was no response. Then, gradually, a reply began to come through the static. The signal was weak and intermittent, but the symbols were unmistakably part of the system that Diego had developed. Someone inside the prison was responding to their communication attempt. The exchange that followed was brief, but emotional. The person inside the prison confirmed that they were holding American prisoners, including members of Task Force Condor. They also confirmed that Diego Santos was alive, but in poor health after decades of captivity and medical experimentation. Most importantly, they provided detailed information about the prison's internal layout and security procedures that would be essential for planning a rescue operation. As the communication session ended, Maria felt tears streaming down her face. After 28 years of not knowing her father, she had finally made contact with him. The man who had written the coded symbols on her arm was alive and waiting for rescue, and she was going to be part of the team that brought him home. But the team celebration was short-lived. Within hours of their communication attempt, they observed increased security activity around the prison facility. Additional guards had been deployed, and patrols were moving through the surrounding area with equipment that suggested they were searching for the source of the unauthorized transmission. Colonel Mitchell realized that their window of opportunity for a rescue operation was closing rapidly. If they were going to extract the prisoners, they would have to act immediately before the enhanced security measures made the mission impossible. The team spent the next day finalizing their rescue plan and preparing their equipment for what would likely be a fighting withdrawal from the area once they reached the prisoners. They had managed to establish contact with Diego Santos and confirm that he and other American soldiers were being held at the facility, but now they faced the most dangerous part of their mission, actually getting inside the prison and bringing the prisoners out alive. As evening approached and they prepared to begin the rescue operation, Maria looked one more time at the symbols on her arm. What had started as a way to honor her mother's memory was about to help her reunite with her father after nearly 3 decades of separation. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she knew that she was finally living up to the legacy of courage and dedication that both of her parents had embodied. The rescue operation began at 3 in the morning, during the darkest hours before dawn, when human alertness naturally reaches its lowest point. Maria and her team had spent weeks planning every detail of their approach to the prison facility, but they all understood that no plan survives contact with reality. Their success would depend on adaptability, courage, and more than a little luck. Colonel Mitchell led the team through a carefully mapped route that took advantage of natural terrain features to avoid the prison's electronic surveillance systems. They moved in single file, communicating only through hand signals and following paths that Diego Santos had described during their coded communication sessions. The intelligence provided by Maria's father proved to be invaluable. His detailed knowledge of the facility's security weaknesses had been gained through 28 years of careful observation and planning. The first major obstacle was the outer perimeter fence, which was equipped with motion sensors and infrared detection systems. However, Diego had identified a section of the fence near a drainage culvert where the sensors had been damaged during a recent storm and had not yet been repaired. The team was able to cut through the fence at this location and enter the facility grounds without triggering any alarms. Inside the perimeter, they faced the more dangerous challenge of avoiding the roving patrols that moved through the area on irregular schedules. Maria's knowledge of her father's coded symbol system proved crucial during this phase of the operation. Using a small infrared transmitter, she was able to send signals to Confederates inside the prison who helped coordinate the timing of their approach to avoid detection by the guards. The prison building itself was a grim concrete structure that showed clear signs of having been designed to hold people against their will for extended periods. The windows were barred and positioned high on the walls to prevent escape attempts, and the entrance was secured with multiple layers of electronic locks and physical barriers. But Diego Santos and his fellow prisoners had spent decades studying the building's weaknesses and planning for the possibility of rescue or escape. Through their coded communication system, he had provided Maria's team with detailed information about a service entrance that was used by maintenance workers and was less heavily monitored than the main entrances. Sergeant Chun used specialized electronic equipment to disable the locks on the service entrance, while the rest of the team maintained security around their position. The process took longer than expected, and Maria felt her anxiety growing as precious minutes passed while they remained exposed in the open area near the building. Finally, the locks disengaged with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the pre-dawn silence. Colonel Mitchell led the team into the building, following a route that Diego had described in detail during their communication sessions. The interior of the prison was even more depressing than Maria had imagined. Long corridors lined with cell doors, harsh fluorescent lighting that never completely turned off, and the pervasive smell of disinfectant mixed with human suffering. They encountered their first guard 15 minutes after entering the building. Sergeant Ramirez was able to neutralize him silently using techniques learned during years of special operations training, but the incident reminded everyone that they were operating in extremely hostile territory where discovery would likely mean death for both the rescue team and the prisoners they were trying to save. The coded symbol system proved its worth again as they navigated through the maze of corridors toward the section of the building where American prisoners were being held. Diego had embedded directional information in his communications that allowed Maria to guide the team directly to their destination without wasting time searching empty areas of the facility. When they finally reached the cell block where Task Force Condor was being held, Maria felt her heart stop. The men she saw through the barred windows were clearly American soldiers, but they had been transformed by decades of captivity and medical experimentation. They were thin and pale, their hair gray or white despite ages that should have left them in their prime. Most heartbreaking was the way they moved, with the careful, deliberate motions of people who had learned to endure pain as a constant companion. But their spirits had not been broken. When Diego Santos saw his daughter for the first time in 28 years, his eyes filled with tears of joy and disbelief. The resemblance between them was unmistakable, but more than physical features, Maria could see in his expression the same determination and courage that had driven her to undertake this dangerous mission. "Maria," he whispered as Sergeant Chun worked to unlock his cell door, "you have your mother's eyes and her beautiful heart. I never dared to hope that I would see either of you again." The reunion was brief, but intensely emotional. Diego embraced his daughter with hands that trembled from years of medical experiments, but his grip was still strong with the determination that had kept him alive through nearly 3 decades of captivity. In that moment, all the questions about her family history, all the pain of growing up without a father, and all the uncertainty about her identity finally found resolution. But there was no time for extended conversation. The team had to move quickly to extract all 4 surviving members of Task Force Condor before their presence was discovered by the guards. Diego's cellmates were in various states of health, but all were capable of walking and eager to finally escape from their prison. Master Sergeant William Torres, the team's former demolitions expert, had lost most of the hearing in his left ear, but was otherwise in relatively good condition. Sergeant First Class Michael Chong, the team's medic, walked with a pronounced limp from medical experiments on his nervous system, but insisted that he could keep up with the group during their escape. The most seriously affected was Staff Sergeant Robert Kim, the team's former intelligence specialist, who suffered from neurological damage that affected his memory and coordination. However, Diego had worked with him for years to maintain his mental function, and Kim was still capable of following instructions and moving under his own power. The extraction from the building proved more challenging than their entry. The guards had discovered the unconscious sentry that Sergeant Ramirez had neutralized, and security throughout the facility had been increased. Alarm bells were ringing as the team made their way back toward the service entrance, and they could hear vehicles approaching from multiple directions. Diego's knowledge of the facility proved invaluable during their escape. He guided them through a series of maintenance tunnels and service corridors that he had mapped during his years of captivity, routes that avoided the main areas where guards were conducting their search. His intimate familiarity with the building's layout allowed the team to stay ahead of their pursuers and reach the outside without engaging in a firefight that would have endangered the weakened prisoners. But their troubles were far from over. Once they reached the perimeter fence, they discovered that the security forces had established a cordon around the entire facility and were conducting a systematic search of the surrounding area. The team's original extraction plan had assumed they would be able to reach their rendezvous point without detection, but that was no longer possible with the enhanced security measures in place. Colonel Mitchell made the decision to implement their backup plan, which involved moving to an alternate extraction point deeper in the mountains. The route would be more difficult for the weakened prisoners, but it would take them away from the concentrated search activities around the immediate vicinity of the prison. The journey through the mountains tested everyone's endurance to its limits. The rescued prisoners had not engaged in significant physical activity for years, and the high altitude and rough terrain made every step a struggle. Maria stayed close to her father, helping him navigate the difficult passages while fighting her own exhaustion and the emotional impact of finally being reunited with him. Diego used the time during their escape to fill in the gaps in Maria's understanding of what had happened to Task Force Condor. He confirmed that the team had been betrayed by elements within the American government who had financial and political interests in protecting the medical research facility. The experiments conducted there had provided valuable intelligence about biological warfare agents and mind control techniques that certain officials found useful for other operations. More importantly, he told Maria about the other American soldiers who had been held at various facilities over the years. Task Force Condor had been just one of several special operations teams that had been abandoned when their missions became politically inconvenient. Diego estimated that dozens of American soldiers were still being held in similar facilities around the world, forgotten by their government, and presumed dead by their families. The information was both valuable and heartbreaking. Maria realized that their rescue mission was just the beginning of a much larger effort that would be needed to expose the full scope of the conspiracy and rescue all of the abandoned soldiers. After 18 hours of movement through increasingly treacherous terrain, the team finally reached their alternate extraction point. General Morrison had kept her word about providing support for the mission, and a medical evacuation helicopter was waiting for them in a secluded valley surrounded by peaks that provided concealment from hostile surveillance. The flight back to American territory was a blur of medical examinations, intelligence debriefings, and emotional conversations between Maria and her father. Diego's physical condition was poor after decades of captivity and medical experimentation, but his spirit remained strong and his memory was clear about the details of his imprisonment. Most importantly, he had maintained detailed mental records of all the American prisoners he had encountered during his captivity, including their names, military units, and the circumstances of their capture. This information would be crucial for identifying other soldiers who might still be alive and in need of rescue. The weeks that followed the rescue operation were a whirlwind of activity as General Morrison used the evidence gathered by Maria's team to expose the conspiracy that had led to the abandonment of Task Force Condor. Congressional hearings were held, criminal charges were filed against several former government officials, and new policies were implemented to prevent similar betrayals in the future. Diego Santos and his fellow prisoners underwent extensive medical treatment and psychological counseling to help them readjust to life outside of captivity. The process was difficult and sometimes painful, but all four men showed remarkable resilience after their ordeal. For Maria, the most rewarding aspect of their success was the opportunity to finally build a relationship with her father. They spent hours talking about her mother, her childhood, and the dreams that had sustained Diego during his years of imprisonment. He was proud of the woman she had become and grateful for the courage that had brought her to rescue him. The coded symbol system that had started as a mystery became the foundation for a new communication method that the military adopted for special operations. Diego worked with intelligence specialists to refine and expand the system, ensuring that future soldiers would have better tools for maintaining contact with their units during dangerous missions. 6 months after the rescue operation, Maria received a promotion to Master Sergeant and was assigned to a new unit that specialized in recovering missing military personnel. Her experience with the Task Force Condor case had given her unique insights into the challenges of conducting rescue operations in hostile territory, and her knowledge of coded communication systems made her invaluable for future missions. General Morrison used her success in exposing the Task Force Condor conspiracy to build support for a larger program aimed at identifying and rescuing abandoned American soldiers around the world. The program operated with full congressional authorization and received substantial funding to conduct the kind of comprehensive investigations that had been impossible when Maria first discovered the symbols on her arm. The story of Maria Santos and her father became a powerful symbol of the military's commitment to leaving no soldier behind, regardless of the political complications that might arise. Their reunion demonstrated that the bonds between soldiers and their families are stronger than any conspiracy, and that the truth will ultimately prevail over attempts to hide it. As Maria looked back on the chain of events that had begun with a routine aircraft repair, she marveled at how much her life had changed. The symbols on her arm were no longer a mystery. They were a testament to the courage and dedication of a father who had never stopped fighting to return to his family, and a reminder of the responsibility that all soldiers share to protect and support each other. The A-10 Warthog that had brought her together with Colonel Mitchell was still flying missions from the same airbase where their investigation had begun. But for Maria Santos, the real mission was just beginning as she continued the work of bringing home the soldiers who had been left behind and ensuring that no American service member would ever be forgotten or abandoned again.